Hold my beer. Honkai Star Rail's power creep isn't that bad. Sort of. At least not as much as people might think. Power creep describes a situation where new characters outperform older characters, thus rendering the latter underpowered. I pulled this from the wiki because no matter how I define it, I know someone's going to call me an idiot. I thought this would be an interesting topic to explore, since I, in addition to many others, feel like some of my favorite older units seem to be falling behind. So I set off to develop the closest thing to an objective comparison as I could using units that share similar spaces. For the purposes of this video, we'll only be discussing limited units at E0 and ignoring light cones, as the limited units tend to be one of the bigger focal points of a patch, and light cones are tailor-made for their respective characters, so there isn't much in the way of significant overlap. I'm also opting to neglect the 4-star units as I don't really believe they're meant to compete with the 5-star ones, with the exception of a few special cases. Also, this video is long. My TikTok attention span won't last. The first pair that came to mind was Jingliu and Kafka. Despite being different paths, both of them share the same element and attack multiple targets. Seems like an easy comparison to make, just throw them both in a spreadsheet and watch as their respective mains rip me a new asshole.
Come on, don't mess.
Turns out it's more complicated than that. Jingliu is often played as a hyper carry, so the other units you choose to bring typically elevate him to King Yuan status. Kafka, on the other hand, is really more like a support unit that enables other units to disrespect your enemies, while also bringing her own war crimes to the table. This basically turns the comparison into Jingliu versus the Kafka crew. Okay, no big deal, just compare best team to best team. Well, now we're looking at different levels of different kinds of investment. Best team given how many pulls? How many 5-star characters are we looking at? How many 5-star light cones? What about the enemies we're hitting? How many targets? How fast are they? Do they have crowd control? Needless to say, but I'll say it anyway, it's kinda hard to make a fair objective comparison. So, let's make unfair subjective ones. The easiest path to poke at is destruction. Looking at limited units, we first had Blade. Blade is pretty cool. Daniel does it better, albeit with more effort. Dan Heng Imbibitor Lunae is pretty cool. Jingliu does it better, albeit with less effort. Jingliu is pretty cool. Acheron does it better, albeit with some restrictions. And she's not even a destruction unit. I guess she's lost again. So surely it can't be as simple as bigger number equals bigger better. It's not. Blade's damage varies depending on how frequent his attacks are, how frequently enemies hit him, and how frequently allies hit him. Even ignoring his damage variance, he has other strengths in that he doesn't die, no matter how much he wants to. He does respectable damage and is oftentimes not at significant risk of falling in combat, assuming you've geared him relatively well. While his solo sustainability is something to be praised, it's also somewhat useless after a while. When I was but a Star Rail fledgling, I remember getting Star Railed. A lot. Memory of Chaos was kind of rough, and my healers weren't geared enough to keep me erect. So I pulled for Blade, a man too angry to die. Being almost entirely self-sustaining and only slightly SP negative helped to relieve a lot of the pressure on my undergeared and overworked Natasha. While this was valuable to me at the time, that time only lasted for about a week or two. After having properly invested in my sustain units, I found the need for Blade's personal thickness to be less valuable. The supporting units you bring for him don't generally have the same durability he does, and because enemies seem to have a raging hard-on for plowing fox girls, you usually need to bring a sustain anyway. When you think of it like that, Jingliu always getting pressed makes a lot more sense. Since you have to bring a healer or a shielder, the value in his own self-sustainability becomes somewhat redundant. After that, all he really has is ease of use and damage, the former of which I'll get to later, and the latter of which might be a little underwhelming for your Jingliu mains. Moving down the list, Dan Heng Imbibitor Lunae does a lot of damage, at the cost of all your skill points. This contrasts greatly with Blade, as Blade's lower damage ceiling is balanced by his more comfortable SP economy, and his inherent ability to alleviate healer pressure. Or make it worse. If you want to make the same compromise with the cooler Daniel, he loses much more damage, which is obviously not ideal as that's the primary reason you'd slot him into your party. After you've had enough time to build your units, this is generally not problematic, since your units will be taking less damage and doing more damage, leading to sustains putting in less work and fights ending more quickly. But if we look at the situation posed earlier where your level of investment isn't as complete, you may find you're using Dan Heng to generate skill points for your sustainers instead. A stronger case can be made for Blade if this game only utilized one character in a fight, making Blade's overwhelming girth much more valuable compared to Dan Heng's glass cannon nature. But this is a team building game, so as always, it's not that simple. While Dan the Man has an undoubtedly higher damage ceiling than Blade, his SP-hungry damage restricts your team building, leaving some fairly powerful supports out of the question. Blade's ease of use allows you to pair him with almost anyone you want, including support units with very strong buffs that crave skill points like I crave emotional support, or even other DPS. Whether trading the damage ceiling for the flexibility is worth it is really up to the player. But on the topic of those other DPS, let's talk about Jingliu. Analyzing the pattern, we can clearly see big trauma equals big damage. Jingliu is similar to Blade in SP economy, only consuming 2 points every 5 turns or so, but her damage rivals Dan Heng's. This throws a few things out of the window regarding Daniel. Dade? Dandy? Where it was ease of use versus damage, but you can't have both. Until now. When Blade looks to do damage, he punches himself in the face. When Jingliu looks to do damage, she punches everyone in the face. If that's not power creep, I don't know what is. While Jingliu does drain everyone's health, it's a pretty negligible amount and nothing your average healer or Xuan can't handle, making this a non-issue. Usually. Instead, Jingliu's weakness comes in the form of downtime. Her baseline damage is nothing to write home about, however after 2 uses of her skill, she enters her spectral transmigration state, which offers massive buffs to her numbers. This state lasts for 2 turns and can be extended with the use of her ultimate, so you get 3 turns to bend your enemies over a table and hump them into submission. Of 5 turns, 3 mean pain. Basic math says that's 2 turns of downtime. In practice, most of the time, this means very little. There are often situations where you can end a wave quickly enough before the cycle rolls over, which effectively saves you that cycle. However, there are instances where you might not be at the right damage threshold to pull off this ideal timing, which could end up costing you several turns to gain enough momentum in order to enter your damage window again, whereas Dan Heng and Blade have relatively consistent output. But looking again at Jingliu's SP economy, her low pressure on your skill points means you can pair her with some pretty strong supports like Bronya, which helps in minimizing your transmigration state downtime with a little bit of speed tuning. So what we're seeing right now is Dan Heng levels of damage with ease of use near to that of Blade's. And finally, up to this date and excluding leaks, we have Acheron. Acheron's only weakness is forgetting where the hotel lobby is.
All these hallways really look the same to me.
On a serious note, her party compositions tend to be a little more restricting, as her Ascension passive incentivizes you to run her with 2 Nihility units for an additional damage multiplier, and she doesn't synergize very well with some other good supports due to her unique energy mechanic. Optimally, she's also SP negative, consuming 1 skill point per turn. To her benefit, the ideal teammates you'd be using with her can be played almost fully SP positive, meaning this is basically not an issue. On top of this, her damage is crazy, and her ultimate, which can see pretty frequent use if you have speedy teammates, breaks enemy toughness regardless of weakness type. We've been talking a lot about DPS up to this point. Let's consider other roles. Sustainers are pretty important, unless you're one of those no sustain zero cycle psychopaths. We have Luocha, a strong healer that can be played fully SP positive, Huohuo, a strong healer who is SP neutral but brings an attack buff and restores energy, Xuan, a generally SP positive unit that provides heavy party mitigation and trickle healing to counter the inevitable chip damage your party takes, and most recently, Aventurine, a near fully SP positive strong healer who I honestly don't want to look at because I lose all my 50/50s. Luocha is the only sustain among our other limited options that can dispel enemy buffs in his kit. He also has a free heal that triggers when an ally falls below a certain health threshold, which comes with a built-in cleanse. Huohuo provides a good attack buff, party-wide cleanses, and energy, but her SP neutral kit, assuming you want full uptime, does impose some team building restrictions. She also has very little in the way of reactive healing, meaning really fast enemies can potentially knock someone out before you have the opportunity to scrape them off the floor yourself. Xuan brings a crit rate and max HP buff to the divining table, on top of crowd control immunity per skill use, but she takes damage in lieu of your party, so heavy AoE damage, which is common in higher levels of Simulated Universe's Swarm Disaster and Golden Gears, can often kill her in one hit. Your party may still be alive, but not for long. She can also struggle against frequent chip damage if a fight drags on for long enough. If you've used her against Sam or Aventurine, you might have felt this already. And speaking of Aventurine, I don't really have anything bad to say about him. He's a tank, but he does damage through follow-up attacks, shielded units are given 50% effect resistance, has party-wide shields that can stack on top of themselves, and his ultimate debuffs an enemy, making them take more crit damage. For a gambler, he's probably the safest bet anyone could make. His only weakness isn't unique to him. As with all other shielders, with the exception of E6 March 7th, if you're caught with your pants down, any damage you take can't be healed back. I've seen some Aventurine havers claim he power creeps Xuan, a unit who is thought to be relatively safe from power creep, and while I don't necessarily fully agree that Aventurine dethrones her in every situation, I can certainly see why people can feel this way given how loaded his dice are. Sure, he can shield, but I bet he can't do this. On to buffers and debuffers, those being Harmony and most Nihility units. There isn't very much to say about Nihility. We have 2 damage over time units in the form of Black Xuan and Kafka, and while they're both dot focused, you ideally run them together, since Kafka enables Xuan to do cassowary levels of damage. Our only other limited Nihility unit is Silverwolf, whose niche is implanting weaknesses, massive defense shredding, and consistent debuffing. The only unit who compares to her in this regard is Pela, the only 4-star unit I'll be talking about, since she's kind of the GOAT. She lacks the debuff frequency and variety, but her defense shred can hit every enemy with good uptime, making her even preferable to Silverwolf in a fair number of situations. And no, Acheron is not really a Nihility unit in terms of kit design. She's really closer to what you'd get if you stuck the Hunt and the Erudition paths in a room and said they weren't allowed to leave until they breed, unless you count instant death as a debuff. In regards to Harmony units, they are all very good. Bronya, a non-limited Harmony unit, still holds up very well even after a year into this game's lifecycle. Huohuo even went as far as to design another, smaller, sassier Bronya that functions in largely the same way, providing damage buffs and action advanced mechanics, but with the added benefit of being SP positive. It seems like a pretty apples to apples comparison where Sparkle just looks better, but this won't always be the case. Bronya's buffs are stronger than Sparkle's for some units, but at the cost of more SP and lower uptime. Sparkle's consistency can average out your damage to be about the same or stronger than what Bronya provides. While this is good in some situations, it's not always preferable. Having a stronger buff can sometimes mean the difference between clearing within the allotted cycle constraints and wasting a cycle for an additional attack or two. However, the consistent buffs may be better as fights draw on for longer. In addition to this, we have their respective action-forward mechanics. In either case, you choose your unit with the biggest baseball bat, and they cut ahead in line. Bronya's action advance is 100% while Sparkle's is 50%. In practice, this often equates to being the same thing, as in the majority of cases, 50% action advance can be enough to get your character to act next, or close to next anyway. However, there are some situations where it's less than ideal, as you'll occasionally find Sparkle's action advance doesn't drag you up far enough before the cycle ends, or before you can break or interrupt an enemy mechanic. Now we have Ruan Mei and Robin, who recently made her debut. Both of them buff the entire team, greatly benefiting dual DPS compositions. Ruan Mei's kit provides break efficiency, break effect, damage percent, resistance penetration, and even a modest speed boost. Robin has some overlap in that she provides a damage percent buff, but after that she brings attack buffs, a full party action advance, a crit damage buff, and she even contributes good damage with coordinated attacks of her own. While both units lend themselves to buffing their teams, they do so in different ways, Ruan Mei being the preferable pick for teams that focus on breaking and dot damage, and Robin being ideal for units that can crit, even more so for follow-up attackers, made obvious by the nature of her coordinated attacks and this passive that says buff follow-up attackers. So while her supporting units seem to be pretty safe, for now, Our DPS are a little more debatable in terms of power creep. In this case, what is a player to do? Rip your wallet open and pull everybody. Dawei needs a new pair of shoes. After all, new DPS are better on average, so you only stand to gain from this. Or do you? Consider the progression path of not only the average player, but also the game. At Star Rail's launch, our first limited unit was Zila of the Hunt path. Assuming you pulled for her, you also have a few units provided for free and no one built. You have resources to farm and characters to work on. From a fairness standpoint, it wouldn't be very poggers of Huohuo to throw a boss like Aventurine, a gacha addict that summons indestructible ads, at another gacha addict who just wants to flex the Zila, a unit whose strength comes from picking off smaller enemies to gain extra turns. It would also be kind of rude of Huohuo to introduce enemies back then with stats they have right now. Your builds are time gated behind Trailblaze power, and it would be incredibly difficult to push this kind of damage on the resources available to us in the first few months of the game. However, it'd be a pretty lame gaming experience if your characters continued to grow while combat content stayed the same. You'd be steamrolling things and nothing would be challenging, which would be a terrible shame for a game where one of the primary gameplay elements is turn-based combat. So, as players acquire and ascend new characters, unlock access to stronger team synergies, level traces, and improve relics, Huohuo also gives enemies stat bumps over time to keep combat engaging. While these stat bumps can make some characters feel like they've fallen off the relevance chart, I'm sure part of that feeling is due to players no longer investing in those units, probably because they've pulled newer units and have switched their build priorities around. For example, I treated my Jingliu much better than I treated my Zila. I've also seen some particularly dedicated Zila mains do more damage than my Jingliu does. That's not to say there is no power creep at play here, and I'm not saying your builds are trash if you're feeling your favorite units are power crept. I'm also not saying they're not trash. I don't know you and I won't pretend to. But there are a number of things to consider, including the content you're up against. I've seen some Zilas slap something silly, but that's assuming you can slaughter against stuff that sides with their strengths. Zila's damage suffers greatly if you can't take advantage of her resurgence procs. Now we transition over to characters and their ease of use. I won't argue that newer units like Acheron and Jingliu aren't a generally smoother experience than piloting Zila, because I'd lose, but I will say that you may notice shifts in how Huohuo designs enemies. When enemies were weaker, it was easy to get Zila's resurgence procs and Memory of Chaos. After so many enemy buffs, it can be difficult to reliably push the same kinds of consistency you did before. Oddly enough, you may find using Zila in pure fiction to be kinda good, since everything in there that isn't the elite enemy is bully bait and dies with fairly little effort. It might not be as SP efficient as bringing an erudition unit, but you can consistently pick off things one by one and turn her into a pseudo AoE character. With the new Apocalyptic Shadow mode coming out, Zila might have a new playground to disappear among the sea of butterflies in. Some of you may have been brute forcing your way through content with Jingliu ever since her debut. You might also be noticing it's not going as smoothly as it used to be. With the addition of Penacony, we find that sweet dreams are made of memes. The Shell of Fated Rage takes severely reduced damage when their toughness isn't broken, and they're not weak to ice, forcing you to bring either Silverwolf for the weakness implant, or swap Jingliu out for a more favorable matchup if you're looking to clear in a timely manner. Even Aventurine, a boss that does have ice weakness, might not feel great for Jingliu mains, as his gambling mechanic removes him from the field, substituting his bullshit dice in instead. Jingliu can hit 3 of the 4 in her transmigration state, but ironically enough, the die can't die. So doing 300k versus doing 3k doesn't really matter as long as you're cleaving more of them to increase your odds of not getting rained on. While winning the bet does fill your energy, effectively gaining you another turn in her enhanced state, sometimes your buffed window ends on that hit and your damage falls off before you get your energy refund. I'm not saying Jingliu is useless for fights like this, but I wouldn't call it an ideal matchup. It seems like a crazy thought, but I wouldn't be surprised if Acheron found herself against some tough competition someday. How spooky. That being said, Mihoyo has a lot of different things to consider. I've posed a situation from the perspective of a player that started when the game launched. What about new players? New players have the problems veterans had at one point with the addition of inflated stat pools. They obviously don't have the same level of investment as the Star Rail boomers, but Mihoyo doesn't want them to have an emasculating experience just because they started later. One solution to this is equilibrium levels, which helps players feel like they're progressing through the world and story at a reasonable difficulty. But this doesn't impact endgame content like Memory of Chaos and Pure Fiction. To address this, Huohuo can raise the damage floors, and therefore ceilings, of their newly released characters. This means players can do relevant damage with less investment, which gives them the freedom to build other units to help even out their roster. This solution brings us back to the initial problem: power creep. Conveniently enough, this is addressed by the final situation I'd like to discuss. What about new players that pull for older characters? F*** 'em. I'm kidding. Mihoyo's developments to the game often not so subtly, retroactively, and indirectly buff older units. The most prominent example that comes to mind is Jingliu. Being the first limited erudition unit, he set the standard for what you can expect erudition units to do, and then he was promptly dominated by Kafka. However, with the release of the Ash Blazing Grand Duke set, his damage ceiling grew fairly significantly. Since then, we've seen the addition of Pure Fiction, a game mode that plays to the strengths of AoE-focused units, and Sparkle, our favorite little terrorist gremlin. While Sparkle and Bronya have significant kit overlap, Sparkle's buffs last until the beginning of her target's next turn, whereas Bronya's ends when her target is finished. As a result, Sparkle can keep Jingliu buffed while his Lightning Lord slays with his Lightning Sword. Jingliu isn't the only winner in this case. Lore-accurate racism in mind, Sparkle shows favoritism towards quantum-oriented teams, providing them an extra attack buff depending on the number of quantum units you want to drag along. That's a crappy action advance joke. This is good for Zila stands, raising her potential damage and making her feel much more consistent in keeping up with the enemy buffs we've been seeing. Now's a good time to remind you of the upcoming Apocalyptic Shadow mode, meant to make hunt units shine. And speaking of shine, back to Sparkle. She also works very well for Blade. Blade doesn't need the skill points that Sparkle provides, but Bronya does. Blade is one of the few characters that's so easy on your SP economy that running Bronya and Sparkle together is not only viable, but strong. For every Bronya action, you get a Blade action, and for every Sparkle action, you get another Blade action. Because Blade is being dragged every which way, his speed is no longer relevant, allowing you to run HP boots to increase his damage per turn. Since he's getting so many more actions, he can more consistently proc his follow-up attacks, on top of generate energy faster for more frequent ultimates. Dan Heng Imbibitor Lunae is another winner, netting himself a strong buffer that's also a solution to his SP gobbling kit. With the release of Robin and her album, an argument could be made that she's stepping on Ruan Mei's toes. But we also have Harmony Trailblazer in the very same patch, who enables the Super Break mechanic. Super Break is more or less what it sounds like. Break, but power crept. When enemies are weakness broken, you get another instance of damage when you hit them, meaning you're incentivized to break enemies faster and keep them broken for longer, both of which Ruan Mei enables. While the scope of this video is meant to target limited 5-star units, these updates also affect our non-limited ones too. Sparkle's buff works for units like Clara in the same way they benefit Jingliu. A strong shielder like Aventurine helps immensely with Yanqing's talent consistency. You could even argue Ruan Mei's and Acheron's release indirectly buffs Welt, making him a pretty effective pseudo-sustain option against some enemies. Himiko sees the light of day with Pure Fiction, and Bailu. Let's talk about FOMO, or the fear of missing out. MiHoYo bends their endgame combat content around the shiny new character, and that makes sense for a few reasons. First, they want to make money. If a new character is strong, people will feel incentivized to spend their hard-earned jades on them. As a player, if you pull for a unit, you want that unit to feel like it was worth it. It's not very often a person will gladly pull for a character that feels like a strict downgrade to their other options. This is bad for people susceptible to FOMO. If you're the type of person that wants to clear the endgame challenges, but you also only want to pull for your favorites, you might feel kind of bad if you find yourself struggling. MiHoYo wants to take advantage of you when you're at your weakest. Don't let them win. They may seem stingy, but they're also surprisingly fair if you cope a little bit. Star Rail is a turn-based game. If you want to win but don't want to pull for characters you don't resonate with, take your time and come up with a strategy. MiHoYo plans for you to pull frequently, and they know the systems they put in place to slow your ascent to greatness. That's why you get about 6 weeks to clear each iteration of Memory of Chaos or Pure Fiction. If you can't do it with what you have built, check to see what others did either through the in-game function or from third-party sources. Use the time you have to build other characters and broaden your options. Different combinations of weird things may work surprisingly well. I believe in you. It says so right here in the script I wrote. Finally, coming full circle, it's important to remember the wiki definition of power creep we used earlier. New units are designed to look good, so they sell, but are older units really underpowered? This may be the case if you're pitting them against content they weren't designed for. You wouldn't judge a turtle based on its ability to climb a tree. Or maybe you would, I don't know you. But despite my arguments, I do believe power creep exists. Versatility and ease of use are important factors, and even characters in a vacuum, because this game's a space comedy, do feel like they're getting stronger on average. I don't think it's really as severe as some people might think, nor is it as simple as characters being strictly better than their predecessors, but I wouldn't go as far as to say any limited 5-star unit is unusable, at least as of the making of this video. Things could certainly change down the line as more and more units release and vacant spaces become less vacant. MiHoYo will have to combat this with creativity, making new mechanics or synergies to keep units from breathing each other's air. This keeps content fresh and players engaged, incentivizing creative thinking and experimenting with units you may not otherwise consider. At the end of the day, the biggest power creep is me, after I've had my protein bar. And a huge thank you to my channel members, Yeehaw ____, Lazarus Valerian, and Crystal, formerly known as Starlight, a bright name either way. All that talk about power creep had me feeling like I should reverse power creep this segment. I have nothing creative to say here. Balls.